let faith arise. Let all agree, there's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise. Let all agree, there's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. Let faith arise. Let all agree. There's no power like His power. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can't move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that Jesus can't do. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a prison wall He can't break through. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Oh, say,
Amen. There's nothing that our God can't do. Matthew 8:23 says, "Then Jesus got into the boat and started across the lake with His disciples. Suddenly a fierce storm struck the lake, with waves breaking into the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke Him up, shouting, 'Lord, save us. We're going to drown.' And Jesus responded, 'Why are you so afraid? You have so little faith.' Then He got up, He rebuked the wind and the waves, and suddenly it was calm. The disciples were amazed, and they said, 'Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey Him?'" Storms can be a frightening thing, but what if the storm isn't our enemy? What if the storm is actually the place where we meet with a powerful God? What if the storm is the place where we actually see God's faithfulness, where we meet God's strong and mighty hand and see His love and experience His love in a way that we just haven't had to before? We wrote this song called Storms actually just recently, and I just wanted to share it with you guys. And we just hope that it blesses you wherever you're watching. You go before me. You are preparing greater things. You will not leave me, so I will not fear the path ahead. Through it all, still I know You are in control, and I will trust You. I will trust You through 1,000 storms. I will seek You though my strength may fail. I will count on Your name. I will lift my eyes to You. I will lift my eyes. I will lift my eyes to You. You go before me. You are preparing greater things. You will not my strength may fail, I will count on your name. I will lift my eyes to you. I will lift my eyes. I will lift my eyes to you. Oh, you. Praise you, Lord. Praise the Lord, my rock. Praise the Lord, my shield and defender. Praise the Lord, my hope. Praise the Lord forever and ever. Praise the Lord, my rock. Praise the Lord, my shield and defender. Praise the Lord, my hope. Praise the Lord forever and ever. Through 1,000 storms, I will seek you, though my strength may fail. I will count on your name. I will lift my eyes to you. I will lift my eyes. I will lift my eyes to you. Oh, through 1,000 storms, I will seek you, though my strength may fail. I will count on your name. I will lift my eyes to you. I will lift my eyes. I will lift my eyes to you. I will trust you.
Hey everybody, it's Jeff here. We're actually out here right now at a staff serve day. We're actually kind of looking at one of our partners, and as we're even gathering up right now, what we're talking about is these guys are working with some of the most affected, some of the most vulnerable in our community. In fact, what we're hearing is virtually everybody is without any source of income whatsoever for the community that we're serving. And so this is an opportunity to pack some food, to get some stuff out to these folks who need it. Just want to let you know your generosity is making this kind of stuff happen. The serve opportunities that you're taking up, your generosity, your donations, all of that stuff is making this kind of thing happen. And everybody here has just got the greatest attitude. I love our staff, as you guys know, incredible folks. Just want to let you know, as we think about just one of the stories that's come up recently is that one of the phrases that people use when they receive these food boxes that will get them through maybe the weekend is that, well, we've heard this a couple of times, is God has not forgotten me. In the midst of all of the struggle and all the trial that they're facing, what they're saying is God has just not forgotten me. And so thank you for helping to remember people. Some people being able to make the most basic needs even being met. One person said just being able to be able to continue to rent the couch that he's renting, to stay in a shelter, to get shelter, to get a place to live. That alone is just it's just evidence that God's still at work. So thank you for being a part of this. Keep up the great work. Love being a part of a church that says that we're in the community for the community, and you're living it out in the best way. So thank you. Keep up the good work. God bless you guys.
Hi everyone, welcome to Harbor Point Church. Thanks so much for joining us online. No matter where you are or who you are watching with, you are not alone. We are here together. It has been so fun watching families experiencing church together, and this weekend seeing parents lead their kids through an opportunity to say, I believe, and make Jesus their forever friend for the very first time. God is so clearly moving and doing some amazing things through this season. If you are joining us online through our website, we have ways for you to connect and chat, a place to receive prayer from our prayer team, links for taking notes. And if you are watching as a family, we have videos, activities for your kids available as well. It is so great to be a part of a church that is eager to serve and to show God's love courageously. At Harbor Point, giving is a regular part of our worship, and it's the most tangible expression of our hearts being centered on God. Your sacrificial generosity is advancing the mission of our church. The mission of our church is clear: to be a safe place for the lost and weary to be rescued, restored, and then sent out to a world in need of Jesus' love. And so today, we invite you to join God in his work through your generosity. We know what an incredible blessing it is to be a part of something beyond ourselves. There are a number of ways that you can give today: online through the giving link, or you can text HP Give to the number 97,000. As you continue to look for ways to take your next step in owning your faith and spiritual growth, we have developed a tool to help you do just that. For those of you who have been through Rooted and are in a life group or looking to join a life group, we have a great new experience called Wayfinding, which guides you through intentional practices that help you know Jesus more deeply, follow Jesus more closely, and show the love of Jesus to the world more courageously. Videos and resources will be available online this week. Be sure to follow us on social media so that we can connect throughout the week and even be praying for each other. So let's take a minute and say hi to one another. Go on our Instagram at Harbor Point Church and comment on the most recent posts saying hi to everyone. Remind everyone that we're all here together. And as always, direct message us if you need anything.
Hey everyone, it is great to be with you once again. For those of you who call Harbor Point Church your home, welcome back. For those of you who are invited by someone else, maybe you were sent a link or invited to watch online with us as well, we are so glad that you have decided to join us today. A few years ago, I had just started taking my then 8-year-old son to start surfing. And on one particular day, he wanted me to record him. Now, usually I'd get invited to go out with him, but that day was gonna be his sort of solo session. And so I was merely the camera crew. So I stood on the shore with my phone and I recorded him. And after an hour or so surfing, my son rambled in, got dried off and put his board in the car, and then he sat down. And as we pull out of the parking lot, he asked to see my phone and to take a look at the footage, So I hand him my phone, and then there was just silence, nothing. He doesn't say anything. And I check on him, I'm like, buddy, you okay? And he's like, yeah. And I go, well, you're being pretty quiet. And he says, after a really long pause, he goes, I just thought I was surfing much bigger waves than that, Dad. I was like, buddy, every surfer thinks that about the waves that they surf. Now, he wanted to surf bigger waves, ones like he thought he was surfing. And in looking at the video, his silence was pretty telling. To get where he wanted to be, to surf the waves he actually thought he was surfing, he'd have to paddle through and into some more treacherous waters alongside older, more experienced surfers. And he knew he'd probably fall a lot more of the time, too. So he came to a realization looking at that little tiny, phone screen. It's this: getting where I want to be requires going through what I want to avoid. See, he was afraid to swim in those waters, the ones between where he was and where he wanted to be. And the Bible has a word for that, that place between where we are and where we're intended to be. That place between places we work so hard often to avoid. That place is what the Bible calls the wilderness. Now, that is a subject worth taking a look at. And fair warning, it's no small topic. So to help us step into it today, I've recruited some help. One of the most insightful people I know on the subject, my wife, Amanda, and she'll be joining us a little while later, and I can't wait for you to hear from her. And she's amazing, especially on this subject. Okay, now last week we started a series called Not My Jesus. And in starting the series, what we said last week, and what will be crucial to bear in mind throughout the rest of this series is this. It's that we're all, every single one of us, unceasingly and often unconsciously interpreting the world around us. I mean, we're constantly trying to make meaning out of finding significance in the world. We're deciding which things actually matter, and we're also kind of deciphering why those things matter constantly. Jesus, not surprisingly, is no different than any other thing we encounter in our world because he's constantly being interpreted too. Now, what's so important when it comes to Jesus is this. The challenge we have to unavoidably confront is that Jesus, who is a real person, can get characterized through the lens of how people would like to see him rather than how he may actually be. And often, whenever we get confused or frustrated by this person we deem to be Jesus, we have a tendency, and this is everyone, by the way, to certain degrees, but we have a tendency to decide, and then, like I said, usually it's when we're frustrated or confused by Jesus, that just can't be. That's not my Jesus. And that idea is what makes Jesus' question to his own disciples in Matthew 16 so unbelievably compelling. After a brief conversation between Jesus and his disciples about who people think Jesus is, the disciples, of course, offering a few ideas, then Jesus turns and asks them this question. We talked about it last week, which is this. Matthew 16:15, but what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? At the heart of it for most of us, the answer to the question about Jesus, this one right here, about whether or not the Jesus we see is our Jesus, is the degree to which we think he addresses our core needs for safety and worthiness and love in the same way we'd address those needs. In other words, it's not uncommon for us to find ourselves pursuing a version of Jesus that really closely resembles us and only a little of who he is. And when that happens, that's when we start losing our way. Pursuing my Jesus can easily be separated from the Jesus, the actual Jesus. And that brings us to today. The attraction to Jesus for a lot of people, for most people who didn't grow up in a home around kind of a faith in Jesus kind of, upbringing, what attracts people to Jesus generally has something to do with the belief in his promise of freedom. Now, however people perceive what freedom might look like, and make no mistake, that is God's agenda in the Bible, to bring about freedom, to break people out of captivity. And when people talk about the fullness of the life that they're seeking, even if they don't know it, it's often synonymous with what the Bible calls freedom. To put it another way, freedom is the wave we envision ourselves surfing, the waves we want to surf out past the stuff we don't think we can get past. Now, the God of the Bible is about freedom, but the way God brings about freedom is that it is always preceded by or always accompanied by the experience of being in the wilderness. Before freedom, there's always the wilderness. And the wilderness, as we talk about it, among other things, is the pathway God takes people on from captivity to freedom. The wilderness is where the access to the usual ways I address my needs for safety and worthiness and love as I see them are inaccessible, unhelpful, or irrelevant, or even ineffective. Now, it's really important to note as we talk today, the kind of wilderness we're talking about isn't what you might think it is. First, not every bad or trying experience is necessarily from God. I mean, that's really critical to understand. The experience of disorientation, loneliness, or despair that we feel is sometimes the result of real evil by which we have been impacted. There is evil that does oppose the work God is accomplishing in the world. So, abuse and neglect and shame and humiliation and abandonment and hate and addiction, et cetera, and so on. These things are not from God. Now, they have a very wildernessy quality, so to speak, about them, but that's not what they are specifically. It's really critical to make note before we continue. This is where we're going to kind of be going. Now, one more thing. Those things that have happened or are happening to us that are undeniably evil, at least the way the Bible addresses them is this, that even the most devastating things aren't wasted by God. The Bible will even go so far as to say this, that what was intended for evil, God has the ability to repurpose for good. So what we're talking about today isn't specifically about addressing those things. We're talking about something else that may feel as though the two things are exactly the same. They're related, but they're not the same. So, okay, just so a little clearer on the idea of where we're headed, I just want to make sure we straighten that out. Wilderness is that often undesirable pathway from captivity to freedom. And on it, the tools we typically use for validation, or probably more importantly, for navigation, are no longer available or accessible. So when that happens, because when everything else is gone, the only thing people have to get them from their captivity to freedom is God himself. My friend Christian Mungai says it like this. He says, you find out that God is all you need when God is all you have. with nothing else to soften the experience of discomfort or disorientation, when all we have is God himself, that's where our character gets transformed. That's where we're far more likely to become the kind of person God has intended us to be. And it's also the way God prepares his people for the freedom they can't even yet imagine. So let's take a look at a case study. And this is probably the most famous of all those examples in the Bible. Maybe you're familiar with it, but it starts, not surprisingly, with the captivity of God's people, the Israelites in Egypt. Looks like this, Exodus 3. The Lord said, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, he says, the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Okay, so God is aware of the captivity of his people, and he's determined to do something about it. It's clear that what he intends to do is to bring his people into a land of freedom, and that's pretty obvious. Then, through a series of miraculous and powerful works, God frees his people, and they walk out of Egypt. They walk directly into the desert wilderness. They don't go immediately from captivity into the land God ultimately intends to bring them. God doesn't just, kind of whisk them, sort of, bring, magic, sort of, poof, freedom into the new land. He clearly had the power to do that, but that's not what he does. Now, you may know the story, but the Israelites first have to go through the desert to get there. It's a journey that should take about 3 weeks, and it ends up taking just a little bit longer. The Bible says it took them 40 years. And we start getting the idea that there is a kind of thing God is doing in the desert wandering. And as we read the story, this is really critical. Rarely do the people understand it or agree with it. They're constantly fighting Moses. On multiple occasions, they even tell him they'd rather go back to the captivity, literally saying that the food was better when they were slaves. And what starts to become apparent is that for the people to live as God intended them to live, as his free people, they're going to have to stop thinking that captivity is a better way to live than freedom. And apparently, that's a really difficult process. In the wilderness, people tend to want what they remember most, even if it's damaging to them, not what God provides for them. They'll say it was better in Egypt over and over again in their captivity, in their wandering. What the people are forgetting is that the wilderness is the place between places. It's not the destination. They quit because they think this is the new normal. Are you with me? It's just a place between places. And the way God utilizes the wilderness is not just a matter of waiting around. The wilderness is not the purposelessness of things. It's the preparation for something else, for somewhere else. Remember, in the wilderness, everything I think I need or have that I once used to give me safety or worth or love is now gone, which means the way God intends to prepare me for the promise of his freedom is without all the stuff I typically use to eliminate my own wilderness kinds of feelings. See, for a lot of people, that experience of no longer having the things that we use to tame anything that feels like wilderness, or at least make the wilderness more kind of bearable, that moment is what can only be described as a kind of powerlessness. That moment is really, well, that's usually the moment people have their not my Jesus moment. And wilderness is about God's power. It's where we have none of ours. It's that kind of supernatural dependence where God is working to bring about something in us. And it's the only way we experience the freedom that he intends to give. You can kind of see where this is going. Now, before the people enter the land God promised them, God says these words. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning of verse 2. He says, remember how the Lord God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. Now notice, God led the people in the wilderness all the way. He didn't abandon them to it. He was up to something the whole time, and he had an intentional agenda for his people. Verse 3, he humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Now, throughout the journey, because they had nothing else, no means of taking care of themselves in the way they were used to doing it, God was their sole provider, and it was by him that they lived. Now, if you skip down a little bit of a passage in Deuteronomy, by the way, this chapter in Deuteronomy is probably one of the best at pulling together how we ought to live in light of how God provides. But before they encounter the freedom to which God is bringing them, he gives them this warning, this caution. Here's what he says, skipping down a little bit again, verse 7. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees and pomegranates, olive oil and honey. It keeps on going. A land where bread will not be scarce and where you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you could dig copper out of the hills. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Now, the idea is that there will be a time when the people will eat and be satisfied. It's critical to understanding that. When they experience that kind of thing, the time of wilderness wandering is over. If they've eaten and are satisfied, the time of wilderness wandering is now over. Now, here's the warning. After you've gotten everything that you need, be careful, he says, verse 11. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God. The thing that might undo all the good that God intended in the wilderness. When we have everything we need, our safety, our sense of worthiness, and our sense of being loved by the usual means, when we have all of those things available to us, the usual means, our lives available to us, the warning is that we might forget God because we don't feel like we need him anymore. The freedom we seek is preceded by the wilderness. Remember, what you find in the Bible is that what God intended for his people, the Israelites, to make happen in the world is ultimately accomplished by Jesus. And to very briefly make that point, in Jesus' ministry can, among other things, be characterized as a ministry of freedom. He's intending and working to free people from whatever captivity they're faced with. He frees the captives and he confronts the captors. It's often you see him wrestling with the captors. Jesus' ministry doesn't start until a few things happen. First, he's baptized by John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, you might know him, the immerser is how it's actually written. And I guess the best way to say it, he's baptized, and then Jesus is approved of by God. Jesus emerges out of the water at his baptism, and this is where God says, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." So, Jesus is deemed to be God's beloved. It's the same title given actually to the Israelites as his own beloved. Then this happens, Luke 4, verse 1. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil and he ate nothing during those days. And at the end of them, he was hungry. The word led here can more actually be translated as the word driven. So Jesus is driven into the wilderness by the Spirit. And remember, the pattern is that freedom is always preceded by the wilderness. And at the end of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, here's what happens, verse 16. He went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed him, and unrolling it he found the place where it is written. So he's about to read the Bible in the synagogue. And remember, he's just finished 40 days in the wilderness. Look at what he reads. Verse 18, quoted from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. The passage he reads about is about setting captives free, bringing about freedom. The whole ministry of Jesus and the freedom he's bringing is preceded by a desert wandering, only now far bigger freedom than from the captivity of the Egyptian Pharaoh, and even bigger than freedom from Caesar's Roman Empire. Jesus' freedom is about the deeper captivity of sin and the powers of evil that hold the whole world captive. Now, just maybe, that's what God intends to do in us individually too, to bring us into the fullness of his own freedom. To get the freedom we long for, we'll have to go through the wilderness first. Remember, freedom is always preceded by wilderness. Freedom is always preceded by the wilderness. So what do we do with the wilderness? Now, to address that topic, we're gonna need some help, like I said, and we brought in my wife, Amanda McGuire. This is Amanda, and I'm going to assume that most of us here are not like really pumped up about the idea of a kind of wilderness experience. We like the HOA kind of manicured version of that, and Amanda is, but something Amanda has taught me and is still teaching me is that freedom is about being released from the bondage of things that we're generally learned to avoid confronting altogether. And the pathway through that is always a pathway through the wilderness. It's always a wilderness experience. Okay, this is Amanda.
Hi.
Amanda, help us to make sense of where God might be inviting us. So let's get started. Help us get there.
So how do we know if we're being invited or ready to enter into a wilderness journey with Jesus? I'm sure it will be different for everyone, but in my own experience with dealing with pain and beginning this journey, each time I've begun at the same starting point. The same questions stir in me, and I think it's something that we can all pay attention to begin to answer for ourselves. Why does this thing keep coming up like a broken record in my life? Why is that thing a thing?
What do you mean by that?
Well, usually our reactions or how we respond to something can reveal what's happening in our hearts. And like a broken record, these things seem to repeat over and over again if we don't identify them and figure out the thing. So asking ourselves questions like, why do I respond like that? What caused me to spiral out of control? What triggered an overly strong emotion? Why did I suddenly go back to my old habits or addictions? If you have a strong reaction to something, whenever you can stop and ask the question, why is this such a thing to me? It might be an invitation from God to address it. Because there may be a cause to that thing that you're reacting to. Like you say, Jeff, it's the thing behind the thing. Maybe there's a hidden wound or pain or an insecurity. Maybe it's something that you've learned to just work around, live with, or avoid. And this reaction is revealing something that may not be as hidden as you thought.
Right. So like recently we were talking about some of this stuff, and I was saying how, even as so much has shifted for us as a church and what we're doing to pivot to kind of a new way of being an online-only church for this season, what started to bubble up in me was really kind of an old but familiar need. I felt such a need all of a sudden to win the approval of people I used to work for and people I used to work with. All of a sudden I felt this huge kind of heavyweight sort of longing to garner their affection and their attention from people I hadn't even seen in some cases in decades. So Amanda, what you're saying, maybe freedom for me, as I might have confused it, isn't about winning their approval. What you're saying is, maybe to ask a different question is, why do I need their approval so badly? Is that kind of more like maybe freedom is not the feeling that, that not even needing the feeling to play this game, this approval and, kind of admiration game at all. The need to show these people is something about a deeper kind of captivity that God may be inviting me to confront. That's kind of what it is, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, that's the right question to ask yourself and to sit with for a little while. What's causing you to need their approval so badly? That's your invitation. His freedom is in you finding that their approval isn't what you really need.
Okay. So the way forward is obviously into a kind of wilderness. And I can feel the wilderness in front of me because I know before the freedom comes, there's wilderness, and this is scary stuff. And I'm not sure I really kind of want to know, I'm not sure I really want to know all of what's in me, all the stuff that I need from these other people. Like, I don't really want to look at that. That feels really, really scary. It feels much more natural for me to play this acceptance-seeking game and sort of approval game. In some ways, I know this sounds weird, that this kind of broken thinking has like some payoffs that have kind of benefited me. Maybe that sort of motivated me to do some stuff. And I don't know that I really want to give that up. And that's part of, I guess, for me, as we talked about, it's a little bit of my own wilderness sort of fear going into it.
Sure. You're not alone in your thoughts about the wilderness. We all have lies we believe about the wilderness. A lot of us believe that the wilderness path is mostly about being abandoned by God, being left completely alone. We think that maybe it's the place where God will forget us. Some people imagine that it's the place that they'll get stuck because they can't imagine a life without their pain or their thing. And because people are afraid of what they don't know, and the wilderness is the place where everything is unfamiliar, people wind up being afraid of the unknown more than the actual wilderness. And this is the reason we start making peace with our captivity. Sometimes we call this an agreement, which basically means because of my fear, what might happen in the wilderness, I'd rather just stay where I am.
Right.
We say stuff like, oh, I've got this under control. I know how to deal with this. I can manage this. Sometimes we'll start to believe that our captivity is part of our identity. This is just part of who I am. When we do that, we are actually kind of saying freedom is scarier than captivity, that captivity is better. I did this for years with my own struggle with anxiety. I just accepted that the lie that this is how God made me. I'm just a nervous person. I made peace with it. It was going to be how I was as a person, so I just started thinking, this is how I'll live. I learned how to deal with it and control it, what I thought. And that was a lie I carried around for way too long.
Yeah, we're really good at telling ourselves some pretty convincing lies. I mean, and I know we're just scratching the surface of this stuff, and maybe for some of us, we need to just stop right there. Like, just merely admitting and addressing some of those familiar lies is probably a lot. So just to recap, why is that thing a thing? That's the first thing. Secondly is identify some of the lies that accompany this wilderness, and then sort of what's next?
Well, it's connected to the lies. It's about dealing with our butts. We all have a butt. We all have really good butts.
Well, some are better than others. Let's be fair.
There's always a really good reason not to take the hard steps through the wilderness and into freedom. People say stuff to themselves all the time that keeps them captive. We'll say, I want to believe God's truth, but I didn't have that kind of childhood. But I don't know how to have that kind of marriage. But it's too hard to stop. But things at work just are too complicated right now. But I'll deal with it after my wedding.
Yeah.
I don't know your exact butt, but I do know that there are countless butts that we let paralyze us. And rather than accepting them, don't be afraid of your butt. Look at your butt. Name your butt. Replace the lie of your big butt with the truth.
Okay, this is a little out of hand, so try to boil this down a little bit. This is
The
awesome.
truth is, there is no reason good enough to justify keeping me captive.
Ooh, come on, say that again.
There is no reason good enough to justify keeping me captive. We have a need to make reasons for not going where God intends to take us. Okay, so say what they are. Hold those reasons up to yourself. And then when you're ready, you'll realize that maybe those reasons aren't good enough to justify keeping you in captivity any longer.
Dang, okay, so I have some work to do.
We all do.
Okay.
But remember, God is always moving toward us, bringing us to his freedom. Maybe he's uncovering some things you've been holding on to that are actually keeping you from his freedom. Maybe this is a journey. It's a really hard journey.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, it took the Israelites 40 years before they were ready for God's freedom. And even then, he gave them the land that they were promised. The Bible says little by little, not all at once. So where do we go from here, Amanda? What do we do?
Maybe it starts with learning how to hear God's voice in prayer. This is something I know I'm still learning how to do, but I do believe God is a God who speaks and leads his people. What his voice sounds like, I don't know what that is for you, but it's God's voice and his truth that lead his people out of captivity. Maybe for some of us, it's going to a counselor about some of the stuff that you don't have language for, to help identify some of the blind spots you don't know were there. Jeff and I have been to marriage counseling, parenting counseling, and tons of individual counseling to help address some of this stuff. Maybe your first step is just believing for the first time God isn't intending to harm you. He leads us to his freedom out of his love and compassion. He loves you as his own child and wants you to know his personal love for you as his father.
Yeah, the truth is, this is a faith journey, and it's a tough one. I mean, faith isn't built without a need for it. Sometimes, and we say this around here from time to time, that a lot of times what we're hoping for in faith is to find a faith that actually requires no faith. I mean, building faith is just so hard, and when it gets tough, that's the time when it's the most convenient to say, that's not my Jesus. You know, every one of my kids surfs now. My oldest just shaped his first surfboard. And it's pretty cool. And all of my kids at some point have had to confront the reality that to surf the way that they all want to surf, they'll have to paddle through the unfamiliar and sometimes scary waters to get there. But when they do, they all always say, it is so worth it. So, one last question. What is the first step God is inviting you to take into his freedom? How long will you determine that managing captivity is better than stepping courageously into the freedom that he's offering you? What's the first step God is inviting you to take into his freedom?
Lord, as we turn to you, come free us from our sin. So we only have today. So let us now begin from dawn to dusk. We're waking up from dawn to dusk. We're waking up. Tomorrow's freedom is today's surrender. We come before you, lay our burdens down. We look to you as our hearts remember. You are the only God. You are our only God. Our only God. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. To you, the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. It is so.
May his favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, on your family and your children, and their children, and their children.
if you're willing, wherever, or however you're watching, however you might do so, would you hold out your hands and would you receive this blessing, just like this? And if you'd rather not, or if it weirds you out, that's cool. You don't, do whatever you need to do to receive this blessing. So if you would, hold out your hands in a posture just to receive what God intends to give to you. And would you receive this? Might God bless you with the faith and the courage it takes to experience the fullness of his freedom. And might you say, upon hearing his voice, that invitation to freedom, through the unfamiliar territory of the wilderness, that's my Jesus. God bless you. We look forward to seeing you very, very soon.